So I'm very happy to introduce our keynote speaker for this theme, Benjamin Roche.
Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot for the organizer for having invited me to this conference. Very happy to be here because last time it was supposed to be south of France. I was organizing in Montpellier, but unfortunately, so it has happened virtually. It has been organized by Montpellier, but not in Montpellier. So hope we will have another opportunity in the next year. I'm also very happy because that's indeed, like a lot of people, I guess, my first in-person conference since a couple of years now. And since actually, so this guy actually jumped into our life. I promise that I won't talk too much about COVID. I know there is some kind of fatigue about that. But we have to recognize that this virus had a very deep impact on, of course, on our societies, on our daily lives. But it has also an impact on, I think, our way to do science, at least on my way to do science. It was quite frustrated because, like a lot of people, I think, in this room, we knew that this kind of thing could happen. It happened many, many times during the last years and during the last decades. We had Ebola, we had avian flu, Zika, chikungunya, and so on and so forth. So we knew that at some point we won't be able to control it and to avoid a pandemic. Of course, the good side of the science implication was that science has been very strongly solicited by authorities, decision makers, and so on and so forth, to provide real-time response, and I think at an unprecedented scale. But I think we have also to recognize that we have failed to prevent this kind of things to happen, even if we knew that this could happen. And so this is why today I would like to do a talk which is not the usual kind of talk that I do. Of course, I want to talk about the scientific knowledge that we're producing in my team, but I also want to talk much more about how we can translate, actually, the research we're doing in this scientific community into policy. So how we can envision plausible solution, and we'll come back to this term later, how we can install some kind of dialogue between science and policy making. So first of all, we have to be clear about what do we observe. So first, the current context is very clear. We have an increasing number of emerging infections during decades. We have 3 times more outbreaks today than 40 years ago. And at the same time, human mobility has also increased very, very quickly. So it's pretty clear that if we continue with this kind of trend, so meaning more emerging infections and more human connectivity, we have everything to see new pandemics during the next year. So now we have to think about how we can learn from what happened and how we can try to avoid these kind of things to happen. And so first, we have to be very aware about what we are talking about. What are these kind of emerging infections? It's also very clear that most of these emerging infections are zoonoses, meaning pathogens that are spilling over from animals to humans. And this spillover process now is pretty well documented, and we know all the different kind of steps that lead from pathogen circulation in animal populations to adaptation to human and efficient interhuman transmission. And we can see that we need to have a lot of conditions that are made to really have this kind of spillover events to occur. And it's definitely clear that we cannot just focus at the end of this chain of events. We have to add several safety nets at each stage of this spillover process, and if possible, as soon as possible in this process. So the idea is really, because all of these pathogens, most of these pathogens are zoonoses, so it means that we really need to understand them in their whole ecosystem, so meaning including the animal populations, in order to prevent their emergence in a sustainable way. And I think that's a very important word here. I will come back to that later. So if we focus on viral emergencies from wildlife, also the messages are pretty clear. They are generally linked to global changes and especially to deforestation for a couple of reasons. First, deforestation is definitely destabilizing our ecosystems, meaning that it can reduce biodiversity. It also scrambles different kind of transmission networks among different animal species, and that in some cases can lead to an increased transmission of pathogen in wildlife. At the same time, deforestation also put human population in closer contact with this wildlife, which is also more and more infected. So we have this kind of perfect cocktail to have more and more zoonosis emergence. At the same time, of course, deforestation is something complex. People are not cutting the trees because they don't like trees. They are deforesting to support some part of their well-being, some part of their food security, to support agricultural development, to support urban expansion. And so you can see that here we have some kind of potential conflict between the consequences at the long term, which could be zoonosis emergence, but not only, of course, climate change and so on and so forth, and some benefits for local population at a short term. So we have to construct this solution with all these different actors in order to be able to implement them in a sustainable way. So what kind of thing we can envision? So I said that deforestation is very, very strong driver for zoonosis emergence. Well, when we say that, so of course, so the natural next step is to think, can we use actually biodiversity conservation as a prevention strategy against zoonosis emergence? So I know that in this community it has been quite a hot debate during the last years, even the last decades, and with a lot of different studies, conflicting studies, working on different kind of system, experimental system, empirical data, meta-analysis, different kind of pathogen, different kind of indicators. And so the least we can say that it's clear that it's not clear. We don't have a consensus about can we use really conservation strategy as a prevention strategy against zoonosis emergence. So what we try to do with my colleague Audrey in Montpellier, so we try to really put around the table some of the most well-known specialists on biological conservation to try to understand what would be the consequences to creating, so the simple way to do conservation, so to create reserve and very protected area. And so I'm not going to go through all the details of this table, but we have identified that when we create different small reserves, so we have the risk of creating hotspot and cold spot of pathogen adaptation and so of pathogen high transmission rates. So in this case, the rate of pathogen adaptation is going to be very key to see what could be the outcome of this kind of strategy on pathogen community structure. On the opposite, if we just want to create some very large reserves, and depending how we design this kind of reserves, we will have this classic biodiversity paradox that we observed, meaning more animal species inside the ecosystem, but and it means that each pathogen can potentially transmit less, but at the same time we have more pathogen inside the system. So what is the net benefits for human health to create this kind of single large reserves? So behind that, so we start to have some insight about that, and Dave Civitello, for instance, published a very influential paper on that a couple of years ago. But behind this idea, there is also this idea about how general could be this kind of dilution effect. And so just to show you some of our results that are coming out from our team, so we try to answer this question on vector-borne disease and mosquito-borne disease to be more precise. So we developed a multi-vector, multi-reservoir species model with a classic SIR model with different vector species, different reservoir species, biting rate between each pair of vector species and reservoir species. And so initially we did some kind of preliminary analysis almost 10 years ago now about what happens if we consider real empirical distribution of community structures. But to do that, we have to make a lot of assumptions that are rarely made on the field. So what we try to do now in this new analysis is to remove as much assumption as we can in order to see if we assume absolutely nothing in terms of transmission intensity, in terms of life cycle of mosquito and reservoir species, etc., what will be the net impact of reservoir species richness on a pathogen transmission? And so just to give you a very short picture about this study. So here on the y-axis, you have the slope of the relationship between pathogen prevalence and reservoir species richness. And roughly, each dot represents a simulation. So we made millions of simulations, and here we have just a subset of simulation when we have vectors that are almost generalist. And when the dot is on the top part of the graph, it means that we have an amplification effect, and when it's in the bottom part, it means that we can expect a dilution effect. And so one first thing which is interesting is that in this kind of settings, without any kind of specific assumption, dilution effect is expected to be much more likely than an amplification effect. But of course, it's just for when we have generalist vector, which is not always very well known. But so the other key message from that is actually to go from an amplification effect to a dilution effect. One key component will be the correlation between reservoir abundance and competence. And this is also something that we generally don't have on real ecological systems. So here is really the frustrating point of my talk, because I would love to elaborate more about those different kind of models and data that we are integrating in my team. But actually, so we have to go back one step and to ask if actually maybe we didn't ask the good question. So the good question is maybe not to figure out if conservation biology works or not, but the point is to figure out in which kind of condition this kind of conservation program can be used as a prevention strategy against zoonoses, and how we can combine it with an improved surveillance. And I say that's the frustrating point of my talk, because at that point, I want really to move towards how we can translate this kind of research into real policies. So the same question is what can we do, but this time what can we do really? How we can really have an impact on the field. And to this point, I want to talk about two things. So the first thing is an international lab we are currently running in Mexico called El Dorado, between my institute in France, Eeid, and the Federal University in Mexico, the UNAM, with a collaboration with Finance, among others. And so our goal is really to try to understand how we can design sustainable conservation strategies that protect human population from virus emergence, and at the same time that does not impact negatively economic growth at a short term, in order to be adopted by the different actors. So we are focusing on Yucatan. So why on Yucatan? Well, actually, some people may think that it's because it's beautiful and Mexican food is amazing. That's correct. I think that, I confess that's part of the plan, definitely. But more seriously, Yucatan is also one of the most deforested parts on Earth. Yucatan has lost 50% of its jungle during the last 30 years. So it's absolutely huge. It's one of the most deforested areas in terms of proportion all over the world. And Mexico has more endangered species than any other countries on Earth. So definitely Yucatan is considered, and also always been considered, as a hotspot for zoonosis emergence. But at the same time, Yucatan is also very strongly connected with Mexico City. And Mexico City is a huge city of 25 million people, strongly connected to the rest of the world. And it means that it's one of the most plausible sources of next pandemic. So it means that what's going on in Yucatan is not just about an issue of Yucatan, of Mexico, but it's definitely a global issue. And I will come back to that later, but there is actually a lot of Yucatan all over the world. And so what we are doing is, so we are monitoring 15 sites across the peninsula, and we're along a gradient of conservation programs, deforestation. So we are monitoring sites where there is a lot of deforestation, sites that are strictly protected, sites where they develop this kind of silvopastoral agricultures, and so on and so forth. And in each of these sites, we are characterizing pathogen circulation in wildlife, hantaviruses, flaviviruses, coronaviruses, in bats, mosquitoes, rodents, birds. At the same time, we are also characterizing pathogen exposure in humans in surrounding villages. And we work with sociologists, anthropologists, and economists to try to understand what are the anthropological factors that drive this human exposure, how we can translate pathogen circulation in wildlife to human exposure in terms of cultural norm, cultural background, personal history, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, so the point is to get all these different kinds of data into a mathematical framework, modeling framework, to first better understand what's going on really in Yucatan, and also to identify what could be the best plausible scenario for actually so the management of Yucatan. And actually what we're doing is not just a research program, we're really trying to construct an ecosystems in order to translate the research we are doing into real policies. So of course, we are targeting the scientific community. We are trying to develop the best science as possible through different kind of fundings. We also try to have a regional impact in terms of capacity building. Researchers and students from Haiti and Guatemala are coming to our research center in Merida to be trained to the different kind of approach that we are doing in Yucatan, and then to go back to Haiti and Guatemala to develop the same kind of thing. We are also setting up an international master program on this kind of approach between the UNAM and the vet school in Lyon, France, in order to train the next generation of Mexican researchers to take the charge of these prevention strategies on the long term. We have also created an NGO to talk with different people in villages, in schools, in hospitals, and so on and so forth, to explain what we are doing, why we are doing that, and why we need them to be involved. And finally, we have installed some kind of dialogue with policy makers at the level of the state of Yucatan, but also at the level of the federal government of Mexico. And we all share actually the same vision, which is to try to make of Yucatan the first territory worldwide when a landscape management plan has been carefully envisioned with this idea to prevent zoonotic disease emergence. So that's the goal we are pursuing with our lab in Merida, and that we are sharing with all the different actors and authorities in Mexico. But the point is, as I said at the beginning, so there is plenty of Yucatan all over the world. And we know that what we are doing in Yucatan is valid for Yucatan. And so it's definitely not easily translated to other countries in Latin America, in Central Africa, or in Southeast Asia. So it means that we have to connect all these different kind of knowledge and to really have a kind of global framework to develop these kind of strategies to have an impact at an international scale. And that at this point that I want to talk about PREZOD. So PREZOD is an international initiative with the objective to prevent zoonotic disease emergence. So it has two kinds of priorities. It's really focusing on prevention. So it has two kinds of priorities. The first one is really an operational one. So it's to make stronger the One Health surveillance networks all over the world to better detect when we have this kind of spillover events, and so to react quickly to avoid a very large outbreak. But it's also to develop scientific research and also other operational activities to understand how we can design this kind of socio-ecosystem management strategies in order to make this socio-ecosystem resilient to zoonotic disease emergence. And to do that, so of course we're trying to produce the best scientific knowledge as possible, but we also try to involve all the different actors. And this is why we have been through this initiative through a co-design process. So we're trying to involve all the different actors all over the world. So the interesting point with PREZOD is that we have quite a high level of political support. It has been announced 1.5 years now ago by President of France, Emmanuel Macron, and it has been immediately supported by the quadripartite, plus the World Bank and the European Commission. So this level of political support is also very important when we try to make this kind of international initiative. So far, yeah, I think that's not the last version, but it doesn't matter. So far now, this is a very international initiative. As I said, Presode involved 11 governments who have signed this declaration of support, as well as 150 institutions all over the world, who are all the different members of Presode. And I just want to thank, well, I see Pete is here, Pete and Matt, because Penn State has been the first US university to join Presode, and I hope we will have much more US universities and other universities all over the world that can join this initiative. And that's an important point because all the members of this international initiative are going to be involved in the adoption of Presode international governance, and as well as its strategic agenda during the General Assembly that will be held at the end of September 2022. Just to give you an idea about what we did during this last year, so we start to organize a series of regional workshops in December 2020. 5 regional workshops. In less than 2 weeks, we have to provide the proof of concept that this kind of initiative works. So in 2 weeks, we have organized 5 regional workshops plus an international conference that has gathered more than 400 people all around the world. So it has been quite a success. Since 1 year now, we are been through this co-design process within 11 regions across the world. So we have organized different kind of co-design workshops that has gathered together more than 1,500 contributors from more than 120 countries. So to identify all the different research gaps, operational needs that are really important at a local point of view. And now at beginning of the year, we have tried to make a synthesis of all this output to contribute to what we call the strategic agenda of the initiatives that we are currently writing, and which is going to be our roadmap for the next 5 to 10 years. So that will be really, we can after see the different funding agencies and so on and so forth to see this is what we want to do, and to also see who wants to do there were things that we were not able to do. So we have first concrete actions that has already happened. So that's not the last version of the talk, sorry. So we already get some funding from the French government, 30 million euros for operational activities that is going to be implemented this year in Senegal, Cameroon, Guinea, Madagascar, and Cambodia. Another funding next year in Haiti, Zimbabwe, Vietnam. We have also 30 million euros for developing academic program of academic research. We are discussing with WHO to also create some kind of joint working group to develop indicators of zoonoses emergence, which is absolutely crucial to understand the impact that prevention strategy can have. But we have also tried to put Presode into some kind of international landscape and international agenda. So Presode has been discussed during the G7 and G20 meetings. We have been also invited to organize a session at high-level events like IUCN, Geneva Forum, and World Health Summit, just to give a few of the different actions that we did during this year. So just to finish, I just want to conclude on this point that this scientific committee working on ecology and evolution of infectious disease is really crucial for the success of initiatives like Presode. So right now we have one university, thanks again Penn State, and another coalition preventing pandemic at the source who has joined the Presode initiatives. We know that I discussed yesterday with the National Academy, which wants to coordinate a little bit different kind of action of Presode on the US territory. We know that also some US federal agencies are interested by this kind of approach, but definitely it will be much more efficient if we can rely on a very strong network of US university rather than a French scientist with beautiful French accent, of course, but can go to the federal agency to try to negotiate. So thank you so much, and I hope a lot of university will join. Thanks.
Thank you, Benjamin, for that very important talk about this link between the science we all do and the need to integrate this into policy. Questions?
Hello. Thank you for the great talk. I was wondering how can pre-zoot be used for ongoing existing zoonotic diseases that are endemic in middle and low-income countries, like, for example, rabies or brucellosis?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So yeah, definitely, so the scope of pre-zoot is supposed to be as large as possible. So during my talk, I did quite a focus on virus, but also we aim to work on something else than virus, like bacteria, parasites, and so on and so forth. So yes, as soon as, a pathogen that are emerging or re-emerging or are sporadically emerging, like rabies, it's definitely inside the scope of pre-zoot. So we have this, and really the focus is to try to have an impact in this specific area of the global south. So it's really at that point that we need to have an impact on the ground. So definitely we will have fundings. We have, as I said, first 60 million euros, 30 million euros, especially in low-income countries, but other fundings will come soon, I hope. But yeah, no, definitely, that's definitely in the scope.
Any other questions? Do we have any online questions? Well, while we're waiting, I have a question. Sure. So many of us in the room, we know very well that a lot of the factors at play, whether you're talking about disease emergence or climate change, these big changes that are happening, involve nonlinear effects. So how do we translate that construct, which seems so hard for the public to comprehend, in terms of how we take action, when we take action?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, that's it's really about how we deliver the message, actually. And this is why we have to be very flexible according to the person we have in front of us, right? So it is going to be very dependent, for instance, for local authorities, it's going to be very dependent on the background, and so, of course, the own agenda of the person you're talking about. And that's especially true when you start to talk with ministries and stuff like that. But actually, so one lesson that I learned from my experience in Yucatan is, actually, so we have created this NGO to try to explain, why there are more and more dengue in Yucatan, why there are more and more rabies, and so on and so forth. And so when we explain that, sometimes in Spanish, sometimes even in Maya, actually people are understanding. Of course, we are not going into all the mechanisms and so on and so forth, but I think it's really about how we deliver the message. And I think they are really connected to the ground, and they are very, very aware about what's going on. They know that when people are coming and start to deforest, they know that there are more mosquitoes around. So they can notice that in their daily life. So that's so this is why I think they can understand this kind of thing.
All right, let's thank Benjamin again.
Thanks.